The Fear Factory Stories.
There are places you know you shouldn't visit, places where the air feels heavy and the dark feels darker. But when you're young and bored, those are exactly the places you find yourself going. It was about 5 years ago, back when I was 21 and still living in a small town called Bristol, Tennessee. My friends, Mark and David, and I had a reputation for getting into all kinds of stupid adventures, and that night was no different. We'd been hearing stories about this old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place everyone said was haunted. Naturally, we wanted to check it out. It was late October, around midnight, and the air was cool, the kind of crisp air that makes everything seem clearer, more alive. The cemetery was just off an old country road, surrounded by dense woods, and you had to take a narrow, overgrown path to get there. We parked my car a little way down the road to avoid being seen and made our way up the path with just one flashlight between the three of us. We were whispering and laughing, trying to keep the mood light, but I could feel a nervous tension building. When we reached the cemetery gates, they were already partially open, creaking softly in the wind. It felt like they were inviting us in. The place looked like something out of an old horror movie. Broken tombstones, overgrown grass, and the faint glow of the moon casting eerie shadows everywhere. "All right, guys, this is it," Mark whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. David, always the brave one, had brought a Ouija board. "Let's see if the stories are true," he said with a grin, and before I could protest, he was already setting up the board on a flat tombstone near the center of the graveyard. He lit 3 small candles around it, saying it would enhance the experience. We sat in a circle, our knees touching, our breath coming out in white puffs. I could hear my own heartbeat. David started with the usual questions. "Is there anyone here with us?" And the planchette moved slightly. I laughed nervously, assuming one of them was messing with me, but no one else was laughing. Suddenly, there was a sound, a rustling in the trees nearby. We all stopped and turned our heads toward the noise. I shined the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," I muttered, trying to calm myself. But then we heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from deeper in the cemetery. It was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. "Okay, very funny," I said, looking at Mark and David, but they both looked just as confused and scared as I was. "That wasn't us," David said, his voice trembling slightly. He continued to move the planchette, asking another question. "Who are you?" And just as he did, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind one of the larger tombstones. My heart raced. "Who's there?" I shouted, shining the flashlight wildly around, but the footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and then, out of nowhere, one of the candles blew out, as if someone had just exhaled right next to it. "We should go," I whispered, but before I could stand up, we heard it again, the voice clearer this time, saying, "Leave now." We didn't need to hear it a third time. We jumped up, grabbed the Ouija board and the flashlight, and started running back toward the path. As we reached the gate, I looked back one last time and saw a figure standing in the distance, just at the edge of the cemetery. It was tall, dark, and I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. We kept running until we reached the car, panting and out of breath. We drove back to David's house in complete silence. None of us spoke for what felt like hours. When we finally got back, we talked about what had happened, each of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some local playing a prank, or maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But then David mentioned something that chilled us all to the bone. When we had packed up the Ouija board, it was missing its planchette. We never went back to that cemetery, and to this day, I still hear that voice in my dreams, telling me to leave. Working the night shift can be lonely, but sometimes it's not the solitude that gets to you. It's the sense that you're not alone when you should be. My name is Jake, and a few years ago I worked as a night security guard in a small, nearly forgotten town called Beckley, West Virginia. I was 27, trying to make ends meet, and the job wasn't glamorous, but it was something. The place was an old abandoned office building downtown, the kind of place that seemed like it should have been torn down years ago. The city kept it standing, though, maybe out of habit, maybe because no one had the energy or the money to knock it down. I started my shift every night at 10 p.m., and I was usually alone, patrolling the empty, echoing halls with my flashlight and a thermos of coffee to keep me awake. The first couple of nights on the job were uneventful, just me and my thoughts. I'd walk up and down the hallways, checking the rooms, making sure there were no broken windows or signs of squatters. But then one night I started to hear things. Small noises at first, like distant footsteps or the creak of a door. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. Old buildings make noises, right? But then it happened again, and this time it was louder. I was on the 3rd floor, doing my rounds, when I heard a sharp bang from the floor above me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. I took a deep breath, shined my flashlight up the stairwell, and decided to check it out. When I got to the 4th floor, I felt the temperature drop. It was freezing, much colder than it had been downstairs. I could see my breath in the air. I walked slowly, listening, looking around. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting quickly across the hallway, just outside the range of my flashlight. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, just the hollow sound of my voice echoing back to me. I decided to keep moving, checking room by room, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But then I heard it again, a rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the walls. I turned around quickly and saw it, just for a split second. A tall, dark figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't supposed to leave my post, but every instinct told me to get out of there. Still, I tried to be rational. Maybe it's just a homeless person, I thought. I had a radio, so I called it in, but no one answered. I was on my own. I kept walking, slowly making my way back toward the stairs. The building seemed darker now, the shadows longer. I felt like I was being watched. I reached the stairwell, but as I started down, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. I spun around, shining my flashlight, and saw a face peeking from around the corner, pale, expressionless, and smiling. I bolted down the stairs, my heart racing. I reached the first floor and ran straight to the main entrance, but the door was stuck. I fumbled with my keys, cursing under my breath, trying to get it open. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps coming down the stairs. Finally, the door gave way and I pushed through it, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I didn't go back in that building alone again. I told my supervisor what happened, and he laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. But I know what I saw. I'll never forget that face, the way it smiled at me from the shadows, like it knew I was afraid. You get used to the silence of the night when you live on a farm, but there are some sounds you just can't ignore, especially when they come from the cornfield. My name is Jake, and I'm 24 years old. I've spent my entire life on my family's farm, nestled deep in the countryside of Indiana, near a small town called Frankfort. My parents have always talked about passing the farm down to me since I'm the oldest of 3 siblings and their only son. But honestly, after what happened a few months ago, I'm not so sure I want that anymore. It was last summer when my parents decided to take a well-deserved vacation for a week, leaving me in charge of the farm, along with my 2 younger sisters, Abby and Kate. Our farm is pretty isolated, surrounded by miles of cornfields. It's the kind of place where you hear every rustle in the wind and every snap of a twig. Most nights, it's peaceful, except for that one night. It started late, around midnight. Abby was in her room, studying for her online college courses, and Kate and I were downstairs, half watching some old sitcom reruns, just killing time before bed. The quiet was suddenly broken by the frantic barking of our 2 dogs outside. They weren't just barking at a raccoon or a deer. This was different, more frantic, like they were sensing something they couldn't see. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to see what had them so riled up. The dogs were at the edge of the yard, facing the cornfield, their hackles up and growling. As I got closer, I heard it. A faint, eerie whistling coming from somewhere deep in the rows of corn. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, like someone was trying to play a tune. I called out, "Hello, who's there?" And the whistling stopped, just like that. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing. I shook it off as some weird echo or a trick of my imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the whistling was closer, much closer. I was in the barn, doing a final check on the animals, when I heard it. I grabbed the flashlight again and headed toward the sound, trying to make out a figure among the tall stalks of corn. "Who's out there?" I shouted, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. I stepped into the field a little, my heart pounding. But the whistling stopped again, like it knew I was coming. I felt a chill run down my spine. For the next few nights, it became a regular thing. always around the same time, always the same strange, haunting whistle coming from the cornfield. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. One night, I'd had enough. I grabbed my dad's rifle from the closet and went outside, determined to catch whoever was messing with us. I stood there, listening to that eerie tune floating through the night air. "Show yourself," I yelled. But the whistling just stopped again, and then after a moment started up again, this time further away. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off whoever it was. There was a pause. Then a low, mocking laugh drifted back through the darkness, followed by the whistle again. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Whoever was out there, they weren't scared. The next morning, my sisters asked me if I knew what it was. I didn't want to scare them, so I shrugged it off, told them it was probably some kid playing a prank. But I knew better. The look in the dogs' eyes, the way they kept growling at the cornfield. It wasn't just a prank. Then one night, the whistling was louder than ever, like it was right outside my window. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the rifle, and stormed outside. I could see a shadowy figure moving in the distance, just beyond the edge of the cornfield. "Hey!" I shouted. The figure paused for a moment, then started whistling again, this time moving deeper into the corn. I fired another shot into the air, and the figure darted away into the darkness. I didn't see it again after that, but I knew it wasn't over. The next day, we found something in the cornfield. A small wooden whistle, carved with strange symbols, placed exactly where I had last seen the figure. I don't know who they were or why they were there, but one thing is clear. They were watching us, waiting for something, and I still hear that whistle in my dreams. Delivering pizzas at night isn't supposed to be scary, but that changed the night I found myself standing in front of a house that should have been empty. I've been working as a pizza delivery driver in Richmond, Virginia, for the past 6 months. It's not a bad gig. I get to drive around, listen to music, and most of the time, the tips are decent. But every now and then I get a delivery that sends a chill down my spine. This one was different. It was a slow Tuesday night, and I was about to clock out when the phone rang in the pizzeria. My manager, Tony, took the order and handed me the slip. "One more for you, Matt," he said, grinning. I sighed and looked at the address. It was in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac called Maple Lane. I grabbed the pizza, a large pepperoni, and headed out. As I drove, the houses grew farther apart, and the streetlights became less frequent. When I finally turned onto Maple Lane, I noticed how dark it was. There wasn't a single light on in any of the houses. I double-checked the address, hoping I had made a mistake, but no. It was right there on the slip. 23 Maple Lane. I pulled up to the house, an old Victorian-style home that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark, covered in a thick layer of dust. But what really caught my attention was the front door. It was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. I hesitated, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I grabbed the pizza and got out of the car, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. As I approached the door, I heard it, a faint, haunting melody of a piano playing from inside the house. I stopped dead in my tracks. The music was soft, almost inviting, but there was something off about it, like it was coming from an old, scratched-up record. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the night air. No answer. I took a step closer to the doorway and peered inside. The foyer was dark, except for a sliver of light coming from a room down the hall. The piano music continued, now a bit louder, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello? I have your pizza," I shouted again, my voice a little shaky this time. Still nothing. I thought about just leaving the pizza on the porch and heading back to my car. But then I remembered the warning Tony always gave us about getting a signature for every delivery. I took a deep breath and decided to step inside, just a few feet, to see if I could find whoever had ordered. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air felt colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I moved cautiously toward the light, my eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The music was louder now, clearly coming from the room at the end of the hall. I reached the doorway and slowly peeked in. The room was empty, but there was an old, dusty grand piano in the corner, its keys moving by themselves, as if played by invisible hands. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to be a trick, right? Some kind of elaborate prank. I took a step back, and that's when I noticed something even stranger. On the wall, there were pictures of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 kids. But the photos were old, faded, like they'd been there for decades, and all the faces had been scratched out. I felt panic start to rise in me. I turned around, ready to bolt out of there, but then I heard a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible voice, saying, "Stay. Please, stay." It sounded like a child, but there was something unnatural about it, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. That was it. I didn't need to hear anything else. I dropped the pizza right there on the floor and sprinted out of the house, not looking back. I jumped into my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine started. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the front door slowly closing on its own, as if someone or something was watching me leave. When I got back to the pizzeria, Tony asked me what had taken so long. I just shook my head and handed him the unsigned slip. "The house was empty," I said, still trying to catch my breath. He looked at me strangely and said, 23 Maple Lane. That place has been abandoned for years. No one's lived there since the fire. I haven't delivered a pizza to that part of town since. Working the night shift at a gas station, you see all sorts of people. But I never thought I'd come face to face with someone who truly terrified me. I've been working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, for about a year now. It's a quiet job most nights, with the occasional trucker or late-night traveler stopping in for gas, snacks, or coffee. But there was one regular customer who started showing up every night around 2 a.m., and his name was Bob. At first, Bob seemed like just another insomniac looking for company. He was in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He always bought the same things: a pack of cigarettes, a black coffee, and a couple of scratch-off lottery tickets. He'd make small talk, nothing too strange, just the usual chit-chat about the weather, local news, or his favorite sports team. I didn't think much of it. But then a few weeks ago, his behavior started to change. Bob would linger around longer, pacing back and forth in front of the counter, mumbling to himself. His eyes, which had once seemed tired but kind, now looked wild and frantic. He'd sometimes laugh nervously for no reason or ask me if I ever felt like someone was watching us. "I feel it, man," he'd whisper, glancing over his shoulder, "like eyes on me all the time." I tried to brush it off as harmless, but it was hard to ignore how his presence made me uneasy. One night, Bob didn't come in at his usual time. I figured he'd finally gotten some sleep or found somewhere else to hang out. But then, just as I was about to lock up for a quick break around 3 a.m., he burst through the door, panting heavily, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Bob, you okay?" I asked, startled by his sudden appearance. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked straight to the back of the store, his hands shaking as he grabbed a bottle of water. He downed it in one gulp, then turned to me with a panicked look in his eyes. "I did something bad, man. Something real bad," he muttered, his voice breaking. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean, Bob? What did you do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. He just kept repeating, "They're coming for me. They're coming," as he glanced around the store like he was expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. Then, without warning, he darted behind the counter and crouched down, hiding like a child, afraid of the dark. I tried to get him to talk to me, to tell me what he meant, but he just kept muttering under his breath. The look in his eyes was pure terror. I knew I needed to call for help, so I picked up the phone and dialed 911. "Yeah, this is Mike at the all-night gas mart on Highway 11. I've got a guy here named Bob. He's acting real strange. Says he did something bad. Can you send someone over?" While I was on the phone, I heard Bob start to sob quietly. I felt sorry for him, but I was also scared. I didn't know what he had done or if he was dangerous. A few minutes later, the police arrived. 2 officers entered the store, and I pointed them toward Bob, who was still crouched behind the counter, mumbling to himself. "Sir, we need you to come out," one of the officers said calmly. Bob looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and shook his head. "I can't. They're watching," he whispered. The officers managed to coax him out, and as they let him outside, I heard him say, "I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to hurt her." My blood ran cold. "Hurt who, Bob?" I whispered, but he was already out the door. The officers told me they'd take him in and check on any missing persons or disturbances in the area. I haven't seen Bob since that night, but I keep thinking about his words. I don't know what he did or what he meant by their coming, but every time the clock strikes 2 a.m., I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'll walk through that door again. We were just three friends looking for a thrill, a bit of excitement on a boring October night. But we found something that none of us were ready for. It was late October, right around Halloween, when my friends Jake, Chris, and I decided we needed a little scare. We were all 19, restless, and in search of something to shake up our small-town boredom in Dover, Delaware. Jake had heard about an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a place that supposedly had a history of strange occurrences. Naturally, we thought it would be the perfect spot for some late-night ghost hunting. Jake, being the fearless one, suggested we bring a Ouija board. "Why not make things interesting?" he said with a mischievous grin. Chris and I hesitated at first, but eventually we agreed. None of us really believed in ghosts, but we figured it would be fun to see if we could scare each other. So we grabbed the board from Jake's attic, piled into my old Jeep, and headed down the narrow, winding road that led to the church. The church itself was everything we hoped it would be: old, weather-beaten, and covered in ivy, with a broken wooden door hanging loosely on its hinges. We parked a little ways down the road and walked the rest of the way, flashlights in hand. The wind howled through the surrounding trees, making them creak and groan like they were whispering secrets to each other. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the hollow, empty space. The inside was dark and smelled of damp wood and dust. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and pieces of stained glass were strewn everywhere. We set up the Ouija board in the middle of the church, using our flashlights to create a dim circle of light around us. Jake lit a few candles he'd brought along, and we sat in a triangle around the board, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. Jake took the lead, of course. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked in a mock-serious tone. We waited, holding our breath. At first, nothing happened, and we exchanged nervous glances, trying not to laugh. Then slowly, the planchette began to move. Chris immediately accused Jake of pushing it, but Jake swore he wasn't. We continued, asking simple questions, and the planchette moved again, spelling out what seemed to be random letters. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air around us colder. My heart started to race, and I could see that Chris's hands were shaking. Suddenly, we heard a loud crack from the back of the church. It sounded like wood splitting, echoing through the empty hall. We all jumped and shined our flashlights in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just shadows dancing on the walls. "Maybe it's just the wind," I whispered, though I didn't believe it myself. We decided to keep going, but now we were all a little on edge. Jake asked another question, something like, "Are you trying to communicate with us?" The planchette didn't move this time, but instead, there was a loud thud behind us, like something heavy had fallen to the ground. We spun around, and that's when we saw it. A small rock, about the size of a fist, had landed on the Ouija board. There was no way any of us could have thrown it. We all had our hands on the planchette just a second ago. Chris let out a nervous laugh, but I could tell he was freaked out. "All right. Who's messing around?" he asked, his voice tense. Before anyone could answer, there was another noise, this time louder, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. We pointed our flashlights toward the sound, and I swear, for a split second, I saw a shadow move across the back of the church. My stomach tightened with fear. "Okay, that's enough," I said, standing up. "We should go." But before we could even gather our things, one of the pews shifted, sliding a few inches across the floor by itself. That was it. Jake and Chris bolted for the door, and I was right behind them. We sprinted out of the church, down the path, and didn't stop until we reached my Jeep. We jumped in, slamming the doors shut, panting and shaking. None of us said a word as I turned the ignition and sped away, leaving that abandoned church in the rearview mirror. Later we tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe the old building was settling. But deep down, I think we all knew it was something more, something we weren't supposed to mess with. And to this day, I still feel a chill when I think about that shadow moving in the dark. I thought working the night shift at a small-town supermarket would be boring, but one night I found out just how wrong I was. I worked the night shift at a small supermarket on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. It's a quiet job, mostly restocking shelves, organizing the aisles, and keeping things tidy for the morning crew. There are only two of us on shift, me and Terry, another guy who's been working there for years. But that night, Terry had called in sick, leaving me alone to handle the shift by myself. It was around midnight, and I was halfway through restocking the cereal aisle when I heard the faint sound of a door creaking open from the back of the store. I thought it might be Terry showing up late, so I called out, "Terry? You there?" No answer. I shrugged it off and continued with my work, thinking maybe it was just the wind pushing against the old back door. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty store. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. They were slow, deliberate, almost like someone was trying not to be heard. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound confident, but my voice trembled slightly. No answer again. I grabbed my flashlight from my cart and slowly made my way down the center aisle. As I turned the corner, I saw a man standing at the far end of the aisle. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden under a hood. He was just standing there, staring straight ahead, not moving, not making a sound. I felt my heart rate quicken. "Hey, buddy, the store is closed. You need to leave," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just kept staring. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to approach him slowly, hoping he was just some lost soul who didn't know we were closed. But as I got closer, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the next aisle. I quickened my pace to catch up, but when I reached the end of the aisle, he was gone. Now I was getting nervous. I checked down each aisle, my flashlight beam cutting through the dimly lit store, but there was no sign of him. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a noise, like something being knocked over. I turned to see a can rolling across the floor, and then out of the corner of my eye I saw him again, just standing there at the end of the frozen food section, his head tilted slightly to the side, his mouth hanging open in a strange grin. I felt a surge of fear. This wasn't just some random guy. There was something off about him. I pulled out my phone and called the police, keeping my eyes on the man the whole time. Yeah, this is Mark at the Billings Supermart. There's a guy in here acting real strange. No, he won't leave, and he's just staring at me. Can you send someone over? As I waited for the police, I decided to keep my distance. The man didn't move. He just kept staring at me with that eerie grin. Every so often, he would take a step forward, then pause, like he was playing some kind of game. The minutes felt like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Finally, the police arrived. 2 officers came in with flashlights, and as soon as they saw the man, they approached him cautiously. "Sir, we need you to leave the premises," one of the officers commanded. The man didn't respond, just kept smiling. Then, without warning, he lunged toward the officers, screaming something incoherent. They quickly subdued him and put him in handcuffs. As they let him out, he kept his eyes locked on me, still smiling, still whispering under his breath. I felt a shiver run down my spine. One of the officers came over and told me they would check the security footage to see how he had gotten in. I nodded, relieved that the stranger was finally gone. But the image of his face, the grin, the wide eyes, stayed with me. I finished my shift, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that strange figure again. That was the last time I ever worked a night shift alone. I always thought that the scariest things on our farm were the coyotes and the storms, but I was wrong. One night I learned there was something, or someone, far more terrifying. My name is Alex, and I'm 24 years old. I've lived on my family's farm in rural Kansas my whole life, just outside of a small town called Holton. My parents had gone away for a week-long trip, leaving me in charge of the place, along with my 2 younger sisters, Lily and Emma. It was supposed to be a quiet week. Just us, the chickens, the cows, and a lot of corn to look after. It was a hot July night when it all started. Lily was upstairs finishing her summer school assignments, and Emma and I were watching TV in the living room, enjoying the cool breeze from the ceiling fan. Outside, everything was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the cornfields swaying in the warm wind. Suddenly, the dogs in the backyard began barking like crazy. Not the usual barking when they saw a raccoon or something. This was more frantic, almost panicked. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to see what had them so riled up. The dogs were both standing at the edge of the yard, facing the cornfield, their ears perked up, growling low. I listened closely and heard it, a faint whistling coming from deep within the rows of tall corn. It sounded like a simple tune, almost cheerful, but it was unnerving in the stillness of the night. "Hey, who's out there?" I shouted, aiming my flashlight toward the sound. The whistling stopped, abruptly. There was silence for a moment, and then I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the dried leaves. Whoever it was, they were moving deeper into the field. I told the dogs to quiet down and decided to head back inside. Maybe it was just a neighbor messing around, I thought. The next night, it happened again. This time, the whistling started even closer to the house. Emma heard it first and came running downstairs, her face pale. "Alex, it's back. The whistling," she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and my dad's old shotgun just in case. I wasn't planning on using it, but I wanted to be prepared. We stood on the porch, listening, waiting. The whistling grew louder, closer, more insistent. "Whoever you are, you need to leave," I shouted into the darkness. No response, just that eerie tune continuing on. I fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. For a moment, the whistling stopped, and I felt a surge of relief. But then, slowly, it started again, just as clear as before, almost mocking me. That's when I felt a knot form in my stomach. Whoever was out there wasn't afraid. I told Emma to go back inside and lock all the doors. I stood there for a few more minutes, listening until the whistling faded away into the night. By the third night, I was on edge. I hadn't slept much, and I could tell my sisters were scared too. We tried to go about our usual routine, but every little noise made us jump. That evening, just after sunset, the dogs started barking again. I didn't even hesitate this time. I grabbed the shotgun and a flashlight and headed straight for the cornfield. The whistling was there, waiting for me, closer than ever. I shone the flashlight into the rows of corn, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was out there. Then I saw it, a figure moving between the stalks, just a silhouette. "Hey!" I yelled again. The figure stopped for a moment, then darted deeper into the corn. I fired another shot into the air and shouted, "This is private property. Get out, now." This time I heard rustling and the sound of running, the footsteps fading away into the distance. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, listening, but the whistling didn't return that night. The next morning we found nothing in the cornfield. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there at all. We never saw the whistling man again, but I've never forgotten those nights. Sometimes, when I'm out in the fields alone, I think I hear that faint, cheerful tune on the wind, and I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. We went up to the mountains for a weekend of snowboarding and fun, but ended up finding something that wasn't on the itinerary, a stranger who seemed to have other plans for us. My girlfriend Sarah and I decided to take a weekend trip to a cozy cabin in the mountains of Colorado, near Breckenridge, for some snowboarding. It was our first trip away together, and we were both excited about hitting the slopes and enjoying some time alone. The drive up was beautiful. The snow was already falling lightly, and everything seemed perfect. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the snow-covered peaks. The cabin was charming, tucked away on a narrow trail off the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees. We unloaded our gear, turned on the heat, and settled in. That first night, we cooked dinner and watched a movie, enjoying the warmth of the crackling fire. It felt like the perfect escape. The next morning, we hit the slopes early, and it was everything we'd hoped for. Fresh powder, sunny skies, and almost no crowds. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was getting dark, and the snow had started falling heavily. A storm was moving in, and the wind was picking up, howling through the trees like a chorus of wolves. We decided to hunker down for the night, lighting a few candles and setting up a board game on the kitchen table. That's when we heard it, a faint crunching of footsteps outside, barely audible over the wind. I glanced at Sarah, and she looked back at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. I grabbed my phone and shone the flashlight through the front window, but all I could see were thick snowflakes dancing in the wind. Then another sound, a soft knock at the door. Not a knock, really, more like a gentle tap. I felt my stomach tighten. Who would be out here in this weather? I moved closer to the door, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. But then, slowly, a figure came into view. A man, standing just a few feet away, his face mostly obscured by a hood. "Hello?" I called out. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, shifting slightly from side to side, like he was trying to stay warm. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I told Sarah to grab her phone and be ready to call 911. I called out again, louder this time. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man's head snapped up, and for a brief second I saw his eyes glint in the dim light from the window. He stepped closer to the door, and my heart started pounding. I told him, "You need to leave, or I'll call the police." He didn't move. Instead, he reached for the doorknob and tried to turn it. That was enough. I ran to the kitchen, where Sarah had pulled a hunting rifle from a cabinet, a precaution her dad had insisted on when we borrowed the cabin. I grabbed it, flung open the window, and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening, even over the wind. The man jumped back, slipping on the icy steps, then scrambled to his feet and took off into the woods. We watched him disappear into the trees, and I slammed the window shut, my hands shaking. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, and the howling wind sounded almost like distant laughter. When the sun finally came up, we packed our things and left, our weekend getaway cut short. Later, we heard on the local news that a man had been arrested not far from where we stayed. He had been found hiding in a nearby shed with a collection of stolen belongings from cabins in the area. I don't know what he wanted from us, but I'm glad we never had to find out. It was a night like any other, just me and the empty road. But sometimes the quietest nights hide the loudest secrets. I was driving home late one night after finishing a shift at the diner. It was past midnight, and the road was nearly deserted. I was on a familiar route, a narrow, winding road just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, with dense woods on either side. The summer air was thick and humid, and I had my windows rolled down, enjoying the breeze as I cruised at a steady pace. Out of nowhere, I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that seemed to pierce through the stillness of the night. It was a woman's scream, coming from the woods on my right. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and listened. A few seconds later, I heard it again. "Help! Somebody! Please help me!" The voice was shaky, filled with terror, and it sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, got out of the car, and called out, "Hello? Are you okay? Where are you?" The voice answered, "Over here. Please, hurry." But something didn't feel right. The scream seemed distant, yet somehow stayed the same volume no matter how far I walked. I stepped into the woods, cautiously moving toward the sound, feeling the cold earth crunch under my boots. I kept calling out, but the woman's voice never seemed to get closer. It was as if she was stuck in the same spot, always just out of reach. After a few minutes, I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a wave of fear washed over me. I realized the screams weren't moving away or toward me. They were just there. It was like they were on a loop, repeating the same desperate plea for help over and over again. I turned around slowly, scanning the shadows of the trees, feeling eyes on me even though I saw nothing. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I began to backtrack, trying to keep my steps as quiet as possible, and hurried back to my car. As I reached the edge of the woods, the screams abruptly stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise pressing down on me. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped off, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching me from the darkness. For days, I tried to forget about it, convincing myself it was just a prank or a trick of my mind. But a week later, I saw a news report that made my stomach drop. The body of a woman in her 30s had been discovered in those very woods by a local hiker. There were no signs of foul play, but what really chilled me was the description. Her clothes were torn, and her hands were bruised, like she had been clawing at the earth. I couldn't stop thinking about that scream, that voice asking for help. I wondered if it was her, if somehow I had heard her last moments, or worse, if it was something more sinister, luring people into the dark. I've avoided that road ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear her voice again, echoing in my mind. "Help! Somebody! Please help me!" I always thought I had nerves of steel, that nothing could truly scare me after years of working night shifts. But that was before I met the man in black. I had been working as a nurse in a geriatric hospital just outside Portland, Oregon, for a few months. It wasn't my first time dealing with elderly patients. I had worked in similar wards before, but something about this place felt off. It was an old building, with long, dimly lit hallways and rooms that seemed to hold on to their shadows just a little too long. I was assigned to the night shift in the Alzheimer's ward, where most of the patients were usually asleep by 11 p.m. That night, I was feeling the strain of the graveyard shift, running on barely any sleep. The patients were all settled, except for one, a woman named Ruth. It was my first night working with her, and she was unusually restless. Every time I entered her room, Ruth would whisper about the man in black standing in the corner, staring at her. She would clutch my arm with surprising strength for someone her age, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to reassure her, gently reminding her that no one was there, that she was safe. But Ruth kept pointing to the same dark corner, insisting she could see him. Her roommate, a quiet lady named Mary, had already asked to have the curtain between their beds closed, perhaps tired of Ruth's constant murmurs. By midnight, the ward was silent. Most of the patients were finally asleep, and the only sounds were the faint beeps of the monitors and the occasional creak of the old building. I was stocking my cart with linens in the supply closet, a tiny room with a single overhead light that flickered every now and then. As I bent down to pick up a stack of towels, I heard a soft whisper, almost like a breath, right behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as exhaustion and resumed my work. But then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I jumped and spun around, but again, nothing. The room was empty. I stepped out into the hallway, trying to catch my breath. I saw no one, just the dim, empty corridor stretching out in both directions. A few hours later, as I made my rounds, I passed Ruth's room again. She was awake, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the same corner. "He's back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man in black. He's smiling at me." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked into the dark corner she was pointing at, seeing nothing but shadows. I tried to calm her, but my own hands were trembling now. I continued with my rounds, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I was in the linen room again when I heard a loud noise outside, like something heavy falling. I opened the door cautiously, and there, through the small glass window, I saw him. A man, dressed in black, standing at the end of the hallway, staring right at me with a sinister grin on his face. My scream echoed through the ward, and within seconds another nurse rushed to my side. I frantically pointed down the hallway, but he was gone. We checked all the rooms, but there was no one. The other nurse looked at me like I had lost my mind, but I knew what I had seen. I returned to Ruth's room one last time that night. She was more agitated than ever, muttering about the voices and the man. "He's here for me," she kept saying. I asked her to describe him, hoping to calm her down. "He's always smiling," she replied, her voice trembling. "How did you know?" I felt my blood run cold. I didn't last another shift. I called the head nurse the next morning and told her I was resigning. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but I had no other explanation. To this day, I can still see that sinister smile in the darkness of that hallway. We thought moving to a small, peaceful town would be a fresh start for us. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers of our new home began. When my wife, Emily, and I moved to a quaint little house in the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, we thought it was the perfect place to start our new life together. We'd only been married for a year and were excited about settling down in a quiet neighborhood where we could eventually raise a family. The house was charming, with a big yard for our future dog and a small patch of forest that bordered the back of the property, adding to its allure. The first few nights were uneventful. We spent our time unpacking and decorating, getting to know the place. But it was on the third night that we first heard it. We had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when we heard faint, crackling music playing from somewhere outside. It wasn't from any of the neighboring houses. Those were too far apart. It was coming from our backyard, drifting in through the closed windows like an old, scratchy record player stuck in time. Emily and I exchanged puzzled looks. I opened the window to get a better listen, and that's when it became clear. It was some kind of vintage song, something that sounded like it was from the 1930s or 40s. The eerie melody sent a chill down my spine. I thought it might be a prank, some kids messing around. I went downstairs, turned on the backyard light, and stepped outside. The moment I did, the music stopped. The only thing I could hear was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. The next day, we laughed it off, thinking it was a one-time thing. But the following night, it happened again, just as we were drifting off to sleep. This time, the music was louder and more unsettling. Emily grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heartbeat quickening. I went to the window again, and that's when I saw it. A small, old-fashioned radio sitting in the middle of the yard, playing the same creepy tune from the night before. I went outside cautiously, picked up the radio, and turned it off. But as soon as I turned to head back inside, I noticed movement at the edge of the forest. 3 shadowy figures were standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. They didn't move or say anything. They just stood there, staring. I yelled at them to leave, but they didn't budge. Instead, they seemed to fade back into the darkness. Emily insisted we call the police. 2 officers arrived and searched the area, but found nothing. They told us it was probably just some local teenagers playing a prank. But the music returned the next night, and the night after that, each time getting louder, each time more unsettling. We began to dread the evenings, knowing that once darkness fell, the music would begin again. Then one night, the music started earlier, just as we were sitting down for dinner. This time, it was a different song, a cheery, upbeat tune that somehow felt even more sinister. I looked out the window, and there they were again, those same 3 figures, standing closer this time, just at the edge of our yard. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the phone and called 911. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the figures, and that's when I saw one of them lift something to their mouth. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by a loud, metallic screech that sent a shiver down my spine. The figures turned and disappeared back into the woods. The police came again, but there was nothing to find. No tracks, no clues, just that same heavy silence that seemed to fill the air whenever they were gone. We decided it was time to stay with friends until we could figure out what to do next. It's been a few weeks, and we haven't gone back. Sometimes I still hear that scratchy old music in my dreams, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed one more night. You never really know what you're signing up for when you book a place online, especially in the middle of nowhere. I learned this the hard way during a solo trip to New Mexico. I had a job interview in Albuquerque, and since it was miles away from my home in Denver, I decided to turn it into a mini vacation. I chose a remote Airbnb in a small town called Gallup, about a half-hour drive from where the interview would be. It was much cheaper than any of the hotels in the city and offered a breathtaking view of the desert. I arrived on a Monday, 2 days before the interview, and spent the first day working remotely from the small living room of the house. It was around 9 p.m. when I decided to take a break and practice some interview questions. That's when I heard a faint tap on the window behind me. It wasn't a knock. It was more like a gentle tap, as if someone had softly drummed their fingers on the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, but all I saw was the darkness of the desert night. Gathering my courage, I stood up and moved closer to the window, squinting to see beyond the glass. Nothing. Maybe it was a moth or some other desert bug. I tried to brush it off, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next day went by without any more strange incidents. I nailed my interview, so I decided to celebrate by exploring the local area. I drove around, tasted some local food, and enjoyed the sun in the backyard of the Airbnb, though I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. That night, as I was binge-watching a show on Netflix, I heard the tapping again, this time louder and more insistent. I jumped up and rushed to the window, but once again, there was no one there. I checked the front door, locked it, and then cautiously went to the back porch. That's when I heard it. A distinct clicking sound, like someone was making a noise with their tongue, coming from somewhere in the dark, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I squinted into the desert, and then I saw it. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, standing just far enough away to blend into the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I shouted, "This is private property. I'm calling the cops." The figure quickly turned and walked away into the night, almost as if disappearing into thin air. The following evening, I was trying to relax in bed, watching another episode of my show, when I heard the noise again. This time it was coming from inside the house. A soft, deliberate click, like the sound I'd heard outside, only muffled. I turned my head towards the closet, the door ajar just slightly, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and ran out of the house. I sat in my car, parked in the driveway, and dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes and searched the house, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt. Everything was exactly where I had left it. I packed my things and drove straight to a hotel in Albuquerque. I tried to get a refund from Airbnb, but they only gave me a partial one. To this day, I still wonder who or what was out there in the desert with me that night.